Hi, I'm Dr. Emmeline Taylor. I'm Associate Professor in Sociology at City University of London, and I'm also the co-director of the Surveillance Studies Network, SSN, which is a charitable company dedicated to the understanding of surveillance in all of its forms on a global scale. I'm presenting to you today from my virtual classroom, fitted with state-of-the-art CCTV cameras, as you can see. One of the key areas that I've been interested in is the impact of surveillance technologies as they're incorporated into educational institutions such as a school, colleges and universities. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the findings from this research that I've been conducting over the course of about 15 years now. And one of the main projects that I'd like to speak about is one of the more recent ones, and it's called Life Through a Lens. Now, this study I conducted in collaboration with Dr. Claire Southerton at the University of New South Wales in Australia. We've called it Life Through a Lens to reflect the methodology that we utilise. We use a technique called photo elicitation. Now, essentially what this means is photo diaries accompanied with journals, where participants document visual representations of their everyday life and then how they experience and negotiate them. The motivation for this study is that a lot of the literature tells us that surveillance can very quickly become embedded into everyday routines. It can feel ordinary and even natural at times to have these daily encounters with these new technologies. We found that through the process of using a camera, it actually created a moment where the participants revisited initial feelings of perhaps discomfort or uncertainty with their engagement with these new technologies. We call this empirical jolting, and we've defined that as an attempt to deliberately disrupt the ordinariness or the routine presence of surveillance. Now, as I said initially, we gave young people a digital camera, and we asked them over the course of 2 weeks to document anything and everything that they felt represented moments of encounters with surveillance. So this could have been CCTV cameras, it could have been something online, it could have been something in the classroom. We left it really open to them to decide how to interpret the task. What became immediately apparent and was quite interesting is that young people felt quite uncomfortable being cast as surveillors. So they were very used to being the objects of surveillance, but they thought that the camera was symbolic of them becoming a surveillor, and this dual positioning or dual role they felt was quite problematic. So they quickly switched to using their mobile phones instead, which they felt was much less conspicuous to be able to snap a quick photograph. Another motivation for this is a lot of the literature talks about young people not really being too bothered about surveillance technologies, that they've lived and they've been born and grown up in the digital age, and so it doesn't feel quite so problematic to them as perhaps it would have done to previous generations. We're often told that young people don't have the same boundaries and parameters around privacy, but I really wanted to problematise this, and the findings did play out to suggest that it's less so about privacy. Young people didn't feel that they necessarily had the power to protect their privacy in ways that they would like to. So rather than privacy building, they engaged in what we term trivialising work, where essentially they would go through a process of encountering a new type of technology that was seeking to harvest and use their data, and they would try and make themselves feel comfortable with that process by downplaying how serious it was, or downplaying whether they were actually the focus or whether it was a more sort of generic type of activity. So it's an important finding, I think, about how individuals potentially deliberately suppress those feelings of discomfort in order to just get on with their everyday lives. There were lots of different realms around where surveillance technologies really infiltrated young people's lives, but I'm going to talk about just 3 of them today. Those being the education sphere. Most of these young people were at university, I'm also going to talk about consumption practices, so that's both in terms of online and also in person, and then the social lives of young people, which arguably are increasingly mediated through new technologies that utilise their data. Now, those three realms I'm presented almost as if they're sort of isolated zones, and absolutely not. We're seeing a blurring of boundaries between different realms of people's lives. I think a great example of that at the moment is during COVID-19 is how education is now taking place in the home. And we're seeing the boundaries become much more porous between family life, between schools. New technologies and equipment really facilitates the way that these boundaries have now become penetrable by different zones of young people's lives. And again, this is quite an important development in terms of being able to maintain different spheres and how you feel and present yourself in different locations. So first of all, in terms of education, my research over several years has shown just a vast number of technologies that now are utilised in schools and colleges in the UK, but also globally. And these are represented by visual technologies such as CCTV or webcams, which are now very prevalent, particularly in English schools. Biometric technologies, including automated fingerprint technology that's now used in a lot of schools as well to enable young people to purchase food at the school canteen, for example, or to take library books out from the school library. Arguably, in itself sort of normalising quite a sophisticated biometric technology by using it for very mundane everyday activities. There's also many examples around spatial tracking within educational areas. So through the use of RFID or GPS tracking to be able to monitor young people as they move around the school campus. Now, some of the images that the participants in Life Through a Lens project provided to us represented how surveillance could be built into the architecture or the very fabric of buildings, and in this case, in terms of education. So the way in which the lecture theatres or classrooms were organised they felt was there to survey them to a certain extent. They were also then seeing the increasing use of technologies to facilitate this as well. So the image around the audio recording and the screen recording, but almost an unawareness of when and how this was taking place. There is, of course, also multiple softwares that are now being used to monitor young people's assessment in particular, as well as their online activities. And so some of these images represented the way that these were being used. This particular technology, Turnitin, which is an anti-plagiarism software. Young people felt that this was quite exposing in some ways, and the journals that they kept was around issues of trust that this raised for them, that now that algorithms were being used to monitor the similarities of their work with somebody else's. Of course, CCTV came up a lot in discussions around the use of surveillance at schools and at university campuses. And it was interesting that some of the participants felt very uncomfortable of actually taking a photograph of the cameras themselves. They felt that this could trigger intervention from security, perhaps, or that it would certainly convey that they were up to no good. So again, that discomfort with feeling as though they were the surveiller rather than the surveilled. So Sarah says, it's a bit nerve-wracking to know that there's footage of me the whole time, from when I go to the bus station and get on the bus and there's CCTV on the bus, get off the bus and I'm walking to campus and around campus, there's video footage of me all day. Hopefully it's a preventative measure to help other people, catch other people. And so here we can hear how Sarah tries to justify this to herself, that she surely would never be the object of scrutiny and that really it's just there for other people. Emily says, I'm just constantly always aware of the camera being there and watching. At any point, someone could be watching, but you actually don't know when that might be. So you're forced into always wondering, like, what I'm doing, and obviously like my changes, and obviously that changes my mannerisms and behaviours, and I like how I hold myself. So for Emily, the presence of the camera was really important here, because it actually meant that she was constantly in a process of regulating her own actions, and almost a performative element to ensure that if anyone would be watching her at that time, that she would be behaving or appear to be behaving appropriately for that camera. So this sense that she could never relax, knowing that the cameras were there and not knowing if she was actually the object of the gaze at that particular moment. There's interesting processes in place, and I think CCTV or visual surveillance is a particularly useful one to think through in terms of how these processes materialise. And one of them is around policy transfer. So it's not uncommon to see very sophisticated, almost military grade type technologies filtering down into educational institutions. Now, there's multiple reasons for this that I won't go into, but in terms of policy transfer, it's a very common and well trodden route that we appear to see. So in terms of CCTV, that of course is one, but we're now seeing it with body-worn cameras as well. So once the purview of police forces only, we're now seeing teachers quite routinely wearing body-worn cameras as well. One of the issues around this is the message that this sends to young people. If they're having to be monitored by body-worn cameras, that their teachers that are trying to teach them, algebra or English, if they're wearing a camera, what message does this tell them about the expectations of their behaviour or participation? So quite a concerning development in many ways. Another key zone of surveillance that participants raised was around consumption. And some of the issues here were around personalised advertising, which young people felt was not only quite intrusive, because sat behind that process was a very clear harvesting of their data, but also the way that this presented quite normative views back at them about the type of person or personality or body that they really should be aspiring to. So Emily says, I was just in shock. How the hell did Facebook get that information that is just completely tailored to me? Like, it's just scary, and it makes me kind of angry that they're pushing me to buy that. Similar images as well were really about that sort of normative view about what young people should be trying to look like and trying to aspire to. There were also several images of areas of consumption, such as shopping malls, and young people expressed how they would feel particularly uncomfortable in these spaces, and they felt that they attracted additional scrutiny and observation by store managers or by security, because they didn't feel that they necessarily conveyed that they had the consumption power that older people potentially would have. And there was almost a feeling of being excluded, or an exclusionary urge about their presence being there, because they wouldn't necessarily have the same spending power. So again, some quite interesting views coming through in terms of how surveillance was being used to monitor sort of inclusion and exclusion, and how that was tied in with consumption. The third zone that came through very clearly was around young people's social lives, and obviously increasingly these are being lived online or through applications, social networking. Social lives are now monitored perhaps in ways that in previous years they would never have been conceivable. Facebook did feature recurrently throughout this, and Alfonso talks about the normalization of Facebook. This particular image he took because this is the page that would be displayed when you logged out from Facebook, and he took it because he said it was such a rare occurrence to actually see the log out page, and what was the implications of that, of the app always being open and live and monitoring in the background. So what additional information around web browsing was that actually harvesting about that young person? So we've already seen in terms of personalised advertising, but what else could they be deducing in terms of political views, you know, your association in different activities and different preferences. So Alfonso really talks about that trivialising work as well. He alludes to it in terms of how Facebook now seems so normal, it seems so mundane, it's just been incorporated into young people's everyday lives. It's no longer problematised in the same way as perhaps it might have been initially. Similarly, Hannah talks about this process of things becoming routine, of them becoming habituated. I don't really think about Facebook collecting information on me. Wow, to be honest, I know that it's a problem and stuff, but I don't think I really care about it that much because, like, what can you do about it? That's just part of modern life, I think. And obviously there's risks, but I'm not sure I even really understand what the surveillance issues are with Facebook knowing my data, which is a problem in itself, actually. I don't really understand, like, I don't even know what that entails really. I don't know how much information they know, and I'm not going to stop using my phone. Everybody does it. I guess I don't think about it at all because it seems normal. If it's normalised and you don't really worry as much, I guess, you just participate without thinking. And I think what Hannah really begins to reveal here is that sort of willful ignorance, because sometimes the reality is almost too much or too confronting. And there's been lots of research in recent times around how large companies such as Facebook or TikTok or, you know, all of these social networking sites really manage to obscure their activities by having very elaborate terms and conditions that stem, you know, pages and pages and pages, which almost make it impossible for young people to make an informed choice about what data they share and how that's then used, quite often in perpetuity. Sarah also picks up on the social networking sites, and the image that she used to convey this was the multiplicity of apps that young people typically will have on their phones. And she says, I find that social networking sites purposely word terms and conditions in a very lengthy way that no one wants to read and no one understands. You don't really know what's in them, but you pretty much understand what they're saying. We own this content and we'll do what we want with it. And at the end of the day, if I need to message a friend, well, that's fine. I sort of know what it entails. I think everyone just kind of blocks that out. I'm sure a lot of people don't really know the extent to which they have complete access to everything. But you just kind of want to use the service, I guess. And so for Sarah, there's a coercion here. There's a trade-off between sharing her personal data and then actually being able to actively participate in the social world, which is now increasingly being lived through these social networking sites. And it's a real conundrum for a lot of young people who want to safeguard their information or feel comfortable with how it's then going to be used at a later date, but they also want to, you know, be part of that world as well. So I think there's some real issues there in terms of how these terms and conditions almost coerce young people into participating. I thought Amelia put this really nicely when she said surveillance is successfully trivialised, and she talked about the way she used location tracking or location-based data as her particular example. Surveillance can be fun. It can be a nice way of presenting yourself, of showing that you've been to particular areas, of gaining social status amongst your peers. This image of her at a beach in Australia, she'd taken the photo and then immediately was encouraged to geolocate it with a frame, and then encouraged to then post that onto a social networking site. In itself, not particularly problematic, but she was beginning to think about how everyday interactions are now purely promoted to be consumed by others, to be sort of circulated amongst her friends. There's lots of other location-based tracking, and one individual had posted a picture of her location services and was quite unsure as to why so many apps needed to know where she was at what time and for how long. So in terms of Facebook, Instagram, Maps, Messages, we're all collating this information about her whereabouts. Much of this is participatory surveillance, and things like activity trackers in terms of health apps and things like that are very much geared towards the people wanting to participate with them. There was also an image, which is the one just at the back here as well, where the screenshot was taken through the sheer surprise that the phone suddenly seemed to know more about this person's whereabouts and their intentions than they seem to. So it pops up to say that you're 24 minutes from home, because it realised it was usually at this point that that individual would set off and leave the campus. I'll leave you with this last image, which was taken by one of the participants, to allude that even when asleep, there's still a certain amount of tracking that's taking place. This person used a sleep tracker in order to monitor her sleep patterns. Again, participatory in many ways, but this idea of it being inescapable. So just this constant monitoring and tracking of sort of bodily movements and functions, and how life was increasingly lived through this quantified self. There's just some last quotes here, and I won't go through all of these, but these are just to really allude to how surveillance can be considered through the 3 C's. This is what the Life Through a Lens project really revealed. And that's that young people feel complicit at times in their own surveillance, and therefore feel that they don't have the power to object or to reject, particularly where it's in terms of lengthy terms and conditions that essentially they have signed up to. So they feel that they almost then need to accept the consequences of having done so. It's certainly revealed through this empirical jolting that I mentioned that surveillance does become concealed. I started with talking about CCTV cameras and a very visual and clear symbol of surveillance, but increasingly we see that these technologies blend into the background. They increasingly use algorithms and software that aren't visual, they're not tangible, and so surveillance practices increasingly do become concealed. There was also the 3rd C around coercion, so young people feeling that quite often they might have a distrust of a particular technology or a reluctance to use it, but if they wanted to participate in other activities that their friends or their family were engaging with, they felt that they had to relinquish some of these concerns that they might have had. They were being coerced into utilising them. So I'll just finish there, but I've only raised some very sort of surface level themes that have come out of my research and also colleagues' research around the surveillance of young people. There's some further reading that I've put up there, so mine and Dr. Sutherton's work, if you want to read up further on the process and the methodology that we used, and also some books that I've been involved with in terms of looking at surveillance, particularly in educational spaces, and just some further information for you there. Okay, thank you so much.